The old bar on Station Omega-7 was nearly empty at this hour. Most of the traders and travelers had gone to sleep, leaving only the night shift workers and a few beings who preferred the quiet darkness. In the corner booth, two figures sat across from each other at a scratched metal table. One held a small recording device. Zixathara lifted her glass with her remaining good arm. The amber liquid inside shook slightly as her clawed hand trembled. She was old for a Keltharian, her once bright blue shell now faded to a dull gray. 3 of her 6 limbs were missing, replaced by basic mechanical parts that clicked softly when she moved. Her compound eyes, still sharp despite her age, stared at the young documentary maker across from her. "You sure you want to hear this story?" she asked in the common tongue, her voice rough from years of cheap alcohol and bitter memories. Most people think they know what happened during the war with the humans. They read the official reports. They watched the sanitized documentaries. They think it was just another conflict between species. Korvan, the filmmaker, adjusted his recording equipment and nodded. His own species, the Vorthak, had not fought in the Terran conflict 20 years ago. They were peaceful traders who stayed out of military matters. This made him perfect for the job. He had no personal feelings about the war that might color his questions. "The coalition files say it was a minor border dispute that escalated," Korvan said carefully. 3 systems, some mining rights, nothing major in the grand scheme of galactic politics. Zixathara made a sound that might have been laughter, but it came out more like a cough. "Minor border dispute," she repeated. "Is that what they call it now?" 3 systems. Yes, we were fighting over 3 systems, but what the files don't tell you is what those humans were like. What they did to us. She took another drink and settled back in her seat. The mechanical joints in her replacement limbs whirred softly as she got comfortable. Around them, the bar hummed with the low sound of the station's life support systems. "I was Commander Zixathara then," she continued. "3rd rank in the Coalition fleet, serving under Admiral Veltar on the battleship Crushing Dawn. We were part of the expedition force sent to claim the Kepler 442 system. Intelligence said there was a small human colony there, maybe 10,000 settlers. Nothing we couldn't handle." The Keltharian veteran paused, her eyes growing distant as she remembered. The humans had been in space for less than 200 years. We Keltharians had been traveling between stars for over 3,000. The Zephyrians, our allies, even longer. The Coalition had conquered or absorbed over 50 different species. We knew how to handle primitive races. "What made you think they were primitive?" Korvan asked. "Everything," Zixathara replied quickly. Their ships were crude metal boxes held together with bolts and welds. No energy shields, no plasma weapons, no gravity manipulation. They used chemical rockets and kinetic projectiles. Bullets, they called them. Tiny pieces of metal shot from tubes. It was like watching children play with toys. She gestured with her good arm, nearly knocking over her glass. Their largest warship was smaller than our escort frigates, the USS Defiance, commanded by some human called Jake Morrison. We laughed when we saw it on our scanners. Admiral Veltar ordered us to disable their ships, not destroy them. He wanted prisoners for study. He was curious about their biology. The old warrior's expression darkened. That curiosity cost us more than we could have imagined. Korvan leaned forward slightly. "What happened during the first engagement?" Zixathara was quiet for a long moment, staring into her drink. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more uncertain. "We came out of hyperspace in perfect formation. 3 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, and a dozen escort ships. The human fleet was waiting for us near the 4th planet. 7 small ships, none larger than our destroyers." She paused to gather her thoughts. Admiral Veltar opened communication channels. He offered them the standard terms: surrender, accept coalition rule, and their people would be relocated safely to a reservation world. It was generous. More generous than most species received. How did they respond? Admiral Morrison, that was the human commander, he listened to the terms quietly. Then he said something I will never forget. He said, "Thank you for the offer, but we'll have to decline. This is our home and we're not leaving." Zixathara shook her head. Just like that, polite, almost friendly, but absolutely final. "No." Negotiation, no counteroffers, just no. The filmmaker checked his recording device to make sure it was still working. What did your admiral do then? Veltar was surprised but not worried. He gave them one more chance to surrender. Morrison said no again, just as politely, so Veltar ordered the attack. Disable their engines, capture their ships. Simple operation that should have taken maybe 30 minutes. Zixathara lifted her glass again but didn't drink. She just stared at the liquid as if seeing something else entirely. The human ships moved like nothing we had ever seen. They scattered in all directions, but not randomly. Each ship went exactly where it needed to go. Morrison's flagship dove straight down toward the planet's gravity well, while the others spread out in a pattern that looked chaotic but wasn't. How could you tell it wasn't chaotic? Because 30 seconds later we were in crossfire from 7 different angles, and every shot they fired hit exactly where they wanted it to hit. The veteran's voice grew more animated as she remembered the details. Their weapons were primitive. Yes, but they used them in ways we never expected. Instead of trying to punch through our shields with heavy weapons, they fired thousands of small projectiles that overwhelmed our defensive systems. She gestured with her mechanical arm, the servos whirring. Captain Lisa Grant, she commanded one of their destroyers called the Hammer. She used the debris from a destroyed asteroid to mask her approach, then fired her entire missile payload at our cruiser Golden Sword from point-blank range. No civilized species fights like that. It's too dangerous. She could have destroyed her own ship, but it worked? It worked, Zixathara admitted grudgingly. Golden Sword lost main engines and had to withdraw from the battle. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Morrison did next. The old Keltharian took a long drink before continuing. While we were dealing with Grant's surprise attack, Morrison brought his ship up from the planet's gravity well at incredible speed. He was using the planet's rotation and gravity to accelerate beyond what his engines should have been capable of. Then he did something that still makes no sense to our tactical computers. She leaned forward, her compound eyes reflecting the dim bar lights. He rammed his ship straight through our formation. Not trying to destroy us, understand? He threaded, the needle between our ships at full acceleration, firing in all directions as he passed. The wake from his engines disrupted our formation, and his weapons fire forced 3 of our ships to take evasive action. One ship disrupted your entire formation? One ship turned our careful battle plan into chaos, Zixathara confirmed. But that still wasn't the end of it. While Morrison was making his impossible run through our fleet, the other human ships had positioned themselves exactly where they needed to be to catch us in crossfire again. Every move they made supported every other move. It was like watching a dance, except the dance was designed to kill us. The veteran finished her drink and set the glass down with a sharp click. The engagement lasted 6 hours. 6 hours against 7 small ships with primitive weapons. When it was over, we had lost 2 destroyers completely, 3 cruisers were heavily damaged, and our escort ships were scattered across half the system. The humans lost 1 ship, and it wasn't even destroyed. Just damaged badly enough that they had to abandon it. Corvin checked his notes. The official report says it was a tactical victory for coalition forces. Zixathara made that sound again, the one that might have been laughter. Tactical victory. Yes, I suppose you could call it that. We held the field when the fighting stopped. The humans withdrew to their colony on the second planet. But victory? She shook her head. That was the day we learned that these humans were not like any species we had encountered before. She signaled the bartender for another drink, her mechanical fingers tapping against the table. That was just the first battle, young one. The first time we realized that our 3,000-year advantage in technology and experience meant nothing against beings who thought about warfare in completely different ways. The old warrior looked directly at the camera. If you want to understand what happened during the Terran conflict, you need to understand this. Humans don't fight wars the way civilized species do. They don't follow the rules that every other race in the galaxy accepts. They make their own rules, and those rules are designed to win at any cost. She paused as the bartender brought her fresh drink. That first battle at Kepler 442 was our introduction to human warfare. We thought we were dealing with primitives who would surrender after the first demonstration of superior firepower. Instead, we found ourselves fighting an enemy that treated Impossible odds as merely interesting challenges. The recording device continued to hum softly in the quiet bar as Zixithara prepared to tell the rest of her story. Zixithara stared at her fresh drink for a long moment before continuing. The mechanical joints in her replacement limbs clicked softly as she shifted in her seat. Around them, the bar remained quiet, except for the low hum of the station's air recycling systems. After Kepler 442, the Coalition High Command decided we needed more forces, she said finally. They sent Admiral Kethivor with 2 full battle groups to finish what we had started. 60 ships total, including 4 dreadnoughts. The humans had maybe 20 ships defending 3 systems. The math was simple. Korvan adjusted his recording device. But the math didn't work out the way you expected. The old Keltharian made a bitter sound. Mathematics assumes both sides follow the same rules. Humans, as we learned, don't follow any rules at all. She took a small sip of her drink and continued. The second engagement was at Vega Prime, a mining colony on the edge of human space. We came out of hyperspace in perfect formation, just like the textbooks taught us. 3 waves of attack. First the heavy ships to break their defenses, then the fast ships to scatter their fleet. Finally the troops transports to secure the planet. Zixithara paused, her compound eyes reflecting the dim lighting. The humans were waiting for us again. Colonel Ryan Torres commanded the ground forces, about 5,000 troops defending a planet with a population of 50,000 civilians. Our invasion force had 20,000 soldiers, plus air support and orbital bombardment capability. What did Torres do? Nothing at first. Our ships took orbit, scanned the planet, located their military bases and defensive positions. Everything was exactly where it should be according to standard defensive doctrine. Bunkers on the high ground, shield generators protecting the main settlements, anti-aircraft weapons covering the obvious landing zones. The veteran's voice grew more animated as she remembered. Admiral Kethivor was pleased. Finally, he said, we were dealing with humans who understood proper military strategy. He ordered the orbital bombardment to begin, targeting their defensive positions. Standard procedure, destroy their heavy weapons, then land troops to mop up resistance. She gestured with her good arm. For 6 hours, we pounded their positions with plasma cannons. Satellite images showed direct hits on bunkers, weapons emplacements, command centers. When the bombardment stopped, our sensors detected no active defensive systems. The planet looked defenseless. But it wasn't? Zixithara shook her head slowly. The first wave of troop transports landed without any resistance. 3,000 soldiers plus armored vehicles and heavy weapons. They secured the landing zones and began advancing toward the main settlements. Everything went according to plan for exactly 47 minutes. The old warrior leaned forward, her mechanical fingers drumming against the table. Then the ground opened up beneath them. What do you mean? Tunnels, Zixithara said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. The humans had dug tunnels everywhere, under the landing zones, under the roads, under their own settlements, while we were bombing empty bunkers on the surface. Their real army was underground, moving through passages they had spent months preparing. She paused to take another drink. No civilized species fights from underground. It's inefficient, dangerous, and goes against every principle of modern warfare. You can't coordinate properly. You can't use heavy weapons. You can't maintain proper communication. Underground warfare died out thousands of years ago when anti-gravity technology made it obsolete. But the humans made it work. They made it work perfectly, the veteran admitted grudgingly. Colonel Torres had his troops positioned in chambers directly under our landing zones. When our soldiers were spread out securing the perimeter, the humans came up through concealed entrances and attacked from behind. Our forces found themselves surrounded by enemies who appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. Zixithara's voice grew more troubled as she continued. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how they coordinated their attacks. Somehow Torres was commanding troops spread across hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, timing their attacks perfectly to support each other. Our communications experts couldn't figure out how they were managing it. The filmmaker checked his notes. How were they managing it? Children, the old Keltharian said flatly. Human children, some as young as 10 years old, running messages through the tunnels. They moved faster and more quietly than our sensors could track, carrying written orders and reports between units. No electronic signatures, no transmissions we could intercept or jam. Just children with pieces of paper, moving through passages too small for our soldiers to follow. She shook her head in obvious disbelief. We had spent centuries developing sophisticated communication networks, quantum entanglement transmitters, neural link systems that could coordinate entire fleets across star systems. The humans used children with handwritten notes, and it worked. Better than our technology. Corvin leaned forward. What happened to your ground forces? Chaos, Zixthera replied simply. Our soldiers were trained for open battlefield combat, not tunnel fighting. Every time they tried to pursue human forces underground, they found themselves in narrow passages where their numbers meant nothing, and their heavy weapons couldn't be used. The humans knew every tunnel, every intersection, every shortcut. Our troops got lost in their own controlled territory. The veteran's mechanical arm whirred as she gestured. Major Katie Walsh led one particularly devastating attack. She brought 200 human soldiers up through tunnels that opened directly into our main supply depot. They destroyed 6 months' worth of ammunition and supplies in 20 minutes, then disappeared back underground before our reinforcements could respond. How did they know where your supply depot was? That's what we couldn't understand, Zixthera said, frustration clear in her voice. Our depot was in a location we had chosen specifically because it was defensible and secret. But somehow, Walsh's tunnels led straight to it. Later we realized they had been watching us from the moment we landed, probably through hidden cameras and sensors we never detected. She took another drink before continuing. The tunnel fighting went on for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of our soldiers chasing ghosts through underground passages, losing equipment and personnel to enemies they rarely saw. Every day, human attacks grew more coordinated and more effective. Every day, our position got worse. What about air support? Couldn't you attack the tunnels from above? The old warrior made that bitter sound again. We tried. Plasma bombardment, seismic charges, even chemical weapons pumped into the tunnel entrances. Nothing worked. The humans had built their tunnel system like a living thing. Damage one part and the rest adapted. They had multiple routes to every location, backup entrances, hidden supply caches. Every tunnel we collapsed, they bypassed with 3 others. Zixthera paused, staring into her drink. And then there was Sergeant Danny Cooper. What about him? Cooper was leading a squad of 12 human soldiers when they got trapped in a tunnel collapse caused by our bombardment. Our sensors detected them, buried under tons of rock with no way out. We thought they were finished. The veteran's voice grew quieter. 6 hours later, they emerged from a completely different tunnel system, 2 kilometers away from where they had been trapped. How? They dug their way out, through solid rock, with nothing but hand tools and improvised explosives. Cooper carried a wounded soldier on his back for the entire 6 hours, digging one-handed while supporting his injured comrade. When they finally emerged, they immediately rejoined the battle and destroyed 2 of our armored vehicles before disappearing again. The old Keltharian shook her head slowly. Any other species would have died in that tunnel collapse. Even if they survived the initial cave-in, they would have waited for rescue or accepted death. The idea of digging through solid rock with hand tools while under enemy fire would never occur to a civilized being. It's irrational, impossible, and completely against survival instincts. But it worked? It worked because humans don't seem to understand the concept of impossible, Zixthera replied. They look at a situation that would stop any rational being and ask themselves not whether they can overcome it, but how they can overcome it. The distinction is important. She gestured toward the bar's windows, which showed the star-filled darkness of space. Every species in the coalition has limits they accept: physical limits, technological limits, strategic limits. We work within those boundaries because that's how civilized warfare is conducted. Humans don't accept limits. They see boundaries as challenges to overcome. The veteran fell silent for a moment, lost in memories. When she spoke again, her voice was almost admiring despite her obvious discomfort with the subject. The ground campaign at Vega Prime lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks of fighting an enemy that refused to fight fair, refused to follow established tactics, refused to accept defeat even when defeat was the only logical outcome. When it was over, we held the planet's surface, but the humans still controlled everything that mattered underground. Did you claim victory? Zixthera made that bitter sound again. Admiral Kethavor declared the planet secured and reported a successful invasion to Coalition Command. But everyone who fought there knew better. We controlled empty buildings and abandoned positions. Zixthera waited for her fresh drink to arrive before speaking again. The bar had grown even quieter, with only the soft hum of life support systems and the distant sound of cargo ships docking at the station. Her compound eyes reflected the overhead lights as she stared into the amber liquid. New Geneva, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. That name still gives me nightmares 20 years later. Corvin adjusted his recording device, making sure it captured every word. What made New Geneva different from the other battles? The old Keltharian veteran took a long drink before answering. New Geneva was supposed to be the end of the war. Coalition High Command had decided that the human resistance was costing too much time and resources. They sent me with Admiral Thexmar and the Third Fleet to finish the humans once and for all. She gestured with her mechanical arm, servos whirring softly. 120 ships, the largest battle fleet the Coalition had assembled in 50 years. Our target was a human colony world with a population of 2 million civilians and maybe 50,000 military personnel. The math seemed simple enough. What was the plan? Total siege, Zixthera replied. No ground invasion, no complex tactics. Just surround the planet, cut off all supply lines, and wait for them to surrender. Most species give up after a few weeks without food or medical supplies. Even the most stubborn races rarely last more than 2 months. The veteran paused, her expression growing darker. We had studied human psychology reports from the earlier battles. Their attachment to their civilians was considered a weakness we could exploit. Threaten the non-combatants, and surely the military would surrender to save innocent lives. How long did you expect the siege to last? 6 weeks, maybe 8 at the outside, Zixthera said. Our intelligence estimated they had food supplies for about a month, and their medical facilities couldn't handle extended casualty care. Admiral Thexamar was so confident he told the fleet we would be home for the Keltharian spawning season. She stared into her drink again. The siege lasted 8 months. Corvan leaned forward. 8 months? What went wrong? Everything, the old warrior said simply, starting with our assumptions about human behavior. We thought cutting off their supply lines would force a quick surrender. Instead, it turned every civilian on the planet into a soldier. Zixthera's mechanical fingers drummed against the table. Commander Pete Robinson was in charge of the planetary defense. Within a week of the siege beginning, he had organized the entire population into a military structure. Children became messengers and factory workers. Elderly civilians operated communication networks. Teenagers worked in ammunition plants built in subway tunnels and abandoned buildings. But surely they couldn't maintain that level of organization for months. The veteran shook her head. That's what we thought. Every species we had encountered before had social structures that collapsed under pressure. Remove the leadership, disrupt the supply chains, and civilian populations panic. But humans did the opposite. The longer we besieged them, the more organized they became. She took another drink before continuing. After 2 months, our sensors detected industrial activity inside the city that shouldn't have been possible. They were manufacturing weapons and ammunition in facilities we couldn't locate or target. Somehow Robinson had converted civilian infrastructure into military production. Where were they getting the raw materials? From us, Zixthera admitted reluctantly. They were salvaging wreckage from our bombardment, recycling debris from destroyed buildings, even mining metals from the planet's infrastructure. Every bomb we dropped became raw material for their war effort. The old Keltharian's voice grew more troubled. But the manufacturing was just the beginning. The real horror was watching how they dealt with casualties. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Every civilized species accepts certain limitations during warfare. When your medical facilities are overwhelmed, you negotiate for humanitarian aid. When your wounded outnumber your healthy, you surrender to prevent unnecessary suffering. These are basic principles of civilized conflict. The humans didn't follow these principles. Humans don't seem to understand the concept of acceptable losses, Sixthera said, her voice growing harder. After 4 months of siege, our intelligence estimated they had suffered over 100,000 casualties. Their hospitals were destroyed, their medical supplies exhausted, their trained doctors either dead or wounded. She leaned forward, her compound eyes fixing on the camera. Do you know what they did? Dr. Amy Foster, their chief medical officer, began training civilians to perform surgery. Shopkeepers, teachers, factory workers, anyone with steady hands became a field medic. She operated on wounded soldiers in the basements of collapsed buildings while our artillery shook the foundations. Above her head, the veteran's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Foster worked for 18 hours a day every day for 6 months. She saved hundreds of lives with improvised equipment and recycled medical supplies. When we finally intercepted her communications, we found she was coordinating a medical network that spanned the entire planet, using coded radio signals to share information about treatments and procedures. How was she managing such a complex operation? Memory, Sixthera replied. Human memory. Foster had memorized the locations of every medical facility, every trained medic, every supply cache on the planet. When electronic communications were jammed, she used human runners to carry detailed medical instructions across hundreds of kilometers of bombed-out territory. The old warrior took another drink, her hand trembling slightly. But Foster was just one example. The entire human population showed the same impossible endurance. After 6 months of constant bombardment, with no outside supplies and minimal food, they were still fighting as effectively as the day the siege began. What about morale? Surely the civilian population was ready to surrender? Sixthera made that bitter sound that might have been laughter. Morale? Their morale got stronger as the siege continued. The longer we attacked them, the more determined they became. It was like watching a wounded animal that gets more dangerous instead of weaker. She gestured toward the window, where stars twinkled in the darkness. Every other species we had fought showed predictable psychological patterns under siege conditions. Despair, panic, gradual acceptance of defeat. Humans showed something else entirely. They showed what they called spite. Spite? The determination to keep fighting not because victory was possible, but because surrender was unacceptable. The veteran explained. They weren't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to make us pay for every meter of ground, every building, every life. They wanted to hurt us as much as possible before they died. Sixthera's voice grew more agitated as she continued. Captain Nick Hayes exemplified this attitude. He commanded one of their artillery units, operating from hidden positions, in the city ruins. For 3 months, his guns disrupted our landing attempts and destroyed our equipment. What happened to him? Plasma strike from one of our cruisers. Direct hit that should have vaporized him and his entire unit. The old Kiltharian paused, staring at her drink. But Hayes didn't die immediately. The plasma blast gave him massive radiation poisoning that should have killed him within hours. Instead, he continued commanding his unit for 3 more days. The veteran's mechanical arm clicked as she gestured. 3 days of coordinating artillery strikes, managing supply runs, and training replacements while slowly dying from radiation sickness. His soldiers said he was giving tactical orders right up until his heart stopped beating. How is that possible? We asked our medical experts the same question. Sixthera replied. They said it was impossible. No known species could function with that level of radiation damage, but Hayes didn't just function. He remained completely effective until the moment he died. She leaned back in her seat, her expression haunted. And here's the truly disturbing part. After Hayes died, his soldiers didn't collapse or lose morale. They fought harder. They followed his final orders for another week until reinforcements arrived. And they attacked our positions with even more determination than before. Why would his death motivate them instead of discourage them? Because humans don't process death the way other species do, the veteran said quietly. Most civilized beings see death as failure, as a reason to avoid further conflict. Humans see death as inspiration, as proof that their cause is worth dying for. They turn their casualties into motivation for continued resistance. Zixthara finished her drink and signaled for another. The siege of New Geneva lasted 8 months, as I said. When it finally ended, we hadn't broken their resistance. We had given up trying. Our own forces were showing signs of psychological damage, from fighting an enemy that refused to accept defeat. What kind of psychological damage? Chronic anxiety, sleep disorders, paranoid behavior, the old warrior listed. Our soldiers started having nightmares about humans who kept fighting after they should have been dead. Medical reports showed widespread stress reactions among troops who had never experienced psychological problems in previous conflicts. She accepted her fresh drink from the bartender. The final battle of New Geneva involved a human counterattack led by Commander Robinson himself. The bar around them had grown even quieter as the station's night cycle deepened. Zixthara sat in silence for several minutes, her mechanical fingers tracing patterns on the scratched metal table. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, not just the weight of bad memories, but something that sounded almost like fear. After New Geneva, everything changed, she said slowly. The coalition wasn't just fighting humans anymore. We were fighting our own minds. Corvin checked his recording device and leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? The old Keltharian veteran took a long drink before answering. Fear is a useful emotion in warfare. It keeps soldiers alive, makes them careful, helps them make smart decisions. But what humans did to us went beyond normal fear. They made us afraid of things that shouldn't have been frightening. She gestured with her good arm toward the window, where cargo ships moved slowly between the stations, docking arms. Sound, for example. Every species uses audio signals for communication and coordination. Military marching, equipment noise, vehicle engines. These are normal battlefield sounds that trained soldiers learn to ignore. But the humans were different. Humans had something they called cadence calls, Zixthara said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Rhythmic chanting while they marched. Lieutenant Colonel Emma Price would lead her regiment in these chants before every battle, and you could hear them coming from kilometers away. The veteran paused, her compound eyes growing distant. At first we thought it was primitive, crude audio discipline that made them easy to locate and target. Our tactical computers calculated that their chanting gave away their position and eliminated any chance of surprise attacks. But that wasn't what happened. Zixthara shook her head slowly. The chanting worked in their favor, not because it helped them coordinate, but because of what it did to us. The sound itself became a weapon. She took another drink, her mechanical hand trembling slightly. Picture this. You're a young Keltharian soldier barely out of training, posted on guard duty at a forward base. It's dark. You're tired, and then you hear it. Hundreds of human voices chanting in perfect rhythm, getting closer every minute. You know they're coming for you, and they want you to know it. The old warrior's voice grew more agitated. The chanting told us exactly where they were, but it also told us they didn't care that we knew. They were confident enough in their abilities to announce their presence and dare us to stop them. That kind of psychological pressure breaks down military discipline faster than any weapon. How did your forces respond? Panic, Zixthara admitted. Soldiers who had fought in dozens of battles would hear human cadence calls and request immediate reinforcements. Some abandoned their positions entirely. Command had to issue specific orders forbidding retreat based solely on audio contact with human forces. She gestured with her mechanical arm, servos whirring. But the chanting was just the beginning. What they did at Proxima Station showed us that humans understood psychological warfare better than species, who had been studying it for thousands of years. The veteran fell silent for a moment, lost in memories. When she continued, her voice was filled with reluctant admiration. Major Tony Clark commanded the Human Engineering Corps at Proxima Station. When we besieged the station, we expected standard defensive procedures, repair damaged systems, maintain life support, conserve power and supplies. What we got instead was something that defied every principle of siege defense. What did Clark do? He turned the entire station into a psychological weapon, Zixthara replied. Every system that should have been conserving power was instead broadcasting signals, playing recordings, creating noise and activity that made it impossible for us to determine the station's actual status. She leaned forward, her compound eyes reflecting the bar's dim lighting. Clark's engineering team somehow kept the station's defensive systems operational for 6 weeks while under constant bombardment. But they didn't just maintain the defenses, they improved them. Every day the station's weapons became more effective, more accurate, more dangerous. How was that possible with limited resources? Chief Engineer Sophie Davis, the old Keltharian, said, her voice filled with disbelief. Davis rewired our own captured technology to work with human systems. She created hybrid weapons that combined our energy technology with their kinetic systems. The result was weapons we didn't understand and couldn't counter. Zixthera took another drink before continuing. But the worst part wasn't the improved weapons. The worst part was not knowing how they were doing it. Our intelligence analysts spent weeks trying to understand how a besieged station with limited supplies could continue upgrading its defensive capabilities. Did you ever figure it out? Salvage and innovation, the veteran replied. Every piece of equipment we lost to their weapons was immediately recovered and studied. Davis had teams of engineers working around the clock to reverse engineer our technology and integrate it with their own systems. She shook her head slowly. When we finally boarded the station after 6 weeks of siege, we found automated defenses that had been built from parts of our own ships. They had taken our weapons and turned them against us more effectively than we had ever used them ourselves. The old warrior's expression grew more troubled. But even the hybrid weapons weren't the most disturbing thing we discovered. The most disturbing thing was how they had been studying us. Studying you? Zixthera nodded grimly. Humans are apparently natural xenopsychologists. They observe other species and quickly learn to exploit psychological weaknesses that we didn't even know we had. Colonel Ben Miller demonstrated this ability during the Battle of Kepler 186. She gestured toward the recording device. Miller somehow knew that our Zephyrian allies would panic if cut off from their hive mind communication network. The Zephyrians had been our allies for over a century, and even we didn't fully understand how dependent they were on constant mental contact with their collective. How did Miller figure it out? Observation and experimentation, the veteran said quietly. Miller's forces had been fighting alongside Zephyrian units for months, apparently studying their behavior patterns and identifying vulnerabilities. When the battle began, his cyber warfare specialist, Captain Rachel Kim, deployed a jamming system that specifically targeted Zephyrian neural frequencies. Zixthera's voice grew more agitated as she continued. Within hours, 3 full battalions of Zephyrian shock troops were routing in complete disorder. These were elite soldiers who had never shown fear in battle, reduced to helpless confusion, because their mental link to the collective had been severed. What was the psychological impact on your other allies? Catastrophic, the old Keltharian admitted. If humans could neutralize the Zephyrians so easily, what could they do to other coalition species? Every race in our alliance began wondering what weaknesses humans might have identified in their psychology and tactics. She took a long drink before continuing. The paranoia spread through our entire command structure. Officers started questioning every decision, wondering if humans had somehow predicted their responses. Battle plans that had been effective for centuries suddenly seemed predictable and vulnerable. The veteran's mechanical arm clicked as she gestured. General Mordak of the Hegemony Forces was so concerned about human psychological warfare that he began changing his tactical plans randomly, hoping to avoid patterns that humans might exploit. The result was complete chaos in our command structure. How were the humans exploiting these patterns? They studied us like scientists studying laboratory specimens, Zixthera said, her voice filled with disturbed fascination. Every battle, every engagement, every communication they intercepted became data for understanding how coalition forces thought and responded. She leaned back in her seat. Captain Laura Stone commanded a human intelligence unit that specialized in what they called behavioral analysis. Stone's team would observe coalition tactics during battle and immediately develop countermeasures based on predicted responses. Can you give a specific example? The old warrior nodded. During the Battle of Wolf 359, Stone predicted that our commander, Admiral Vexthul, would retreat to high orbit when faced with superior numbers. She was right. But instead of simply pursuing, Stone's forces had prepared for exactly that response. Six Thera's voice grew more troubled. They had positioned hidden mines along the retreat route that Vexthal was most likely to take. Not the obvious route, not the safest route, but the specific path that a Keltharian admiral with Vexthal's training and experience would choose under those circumstances. How could they predict something that specific? Because they had studied hundreds of hours of recordings from previous Keltharian naval engagements. The veteran replied, Stone's team knew our tactical doctrines better than we did. They identified patterns in our decision-making that we didn't even realize existed. She gestured with her mechanical fingers. The psychological impact was devastating. Vexthal lost 12 ships to those mines, but the real damage was to morale. If humans could predict our responses that accurately, how could we ever achieve tactical surprise? The old Keltharian took another drink, her expression growing darker. The station's night cycle was reaching its deepest point when Zixathara began the final part of her story. The bar was nearly empty now, with only the soft hum of air recyclers and the distant sounds of automated cargo systems breaking the silence. The old Keltharian veteran stared at her drink for a long time before speaking. Terra, she said finally, her voice barely audible. The final battle. Coalition High Command called it Operation Cleansing Fire. The plan was simple. Strike directly at the human homeworld and force an immediate surrender. End the war in one decisive engagement. Corvin adjusted his recording device, sensing that this final part of the story would be the most important. How many ships did the Coalition send? Everything we had left, Zixthara replied. 347 warships from 12 different species, the largest invasion fleet in galactic history. Admiral Kolthessa commanded the operation, personally with orders to accept nothing less than total human capitulation. She took a small sip of her drink, her mechanical hand steady despite the weight of memories. The plan was overwhelming force applied quickly. Destroy the human orbital defenses, land troops on the surface, capture their government, and force surrender before they could organize effective resistance. What went wrong? The old warrior made that bitter sound again. Nothing went wrong with the plan. The plan worked exactly as intended. We destroyed their orbital stations, scattered their fleet, established orbital control, and began landing troops. By every military standard, the battle should have been over within hours. Zixthara paused, her compound eyes reflecting the dim bar lights. But humans don't follow military standards. When we reached Terra, we found ourselves facing every human commander who had been making our lives difficult for years, all working together to defend their homeworld. Who was commanding the defense? Admiral Chris Thompson coordinated the space battle. General Linda Parker commanded ground forces, and Commander Alex Rivera managed planetary logistics, the veteran listed. But that wasn't the frightening part. The frightening part was how they organized their entire civilization for war. She gestured with her good arm. On every other world we had conquered, military and civilian populations were separate. Soldiers fought, civilians hid or evacuated. On Terra, everyone was a soldier. Children operated mining platforms converted into weapons platforms. Elderly civilians coordinated supply runs through asteroid fields under constant fire. The old Keltharian's voice grew more troubled as she continued. Their president, John Mitchell, was 73 years old and had never served in the military. But when we arrived at Terra, we found him personally commanding fighter squadrons, leading attacks against our capital ships. A 73-year-old civilian was flying combat missions? Not just flying, Zixthara corrected. Leading. Mitchell's squadron destroyed 2 of our cruisers and damaged a battleship before we could organize effective countermeasures. Civilian government leader was outfighting our trained military pilots. She took another drink, her expression growing more haunted. But Mitchell was just one example. Every human on their homeworld had been organized into the defense effort. Factory workers built weapons during their shifts, then operated anti-aircraft guns during off hours. Teachers coordinated communication networks while still educating children in bomb shelters. The veteran's mechanical arm clicked as she gestured toward the window. We had studied human society for years, trying to understand their weaknesses, We knew they valued individual freedom, personal choice, civilian governance. We expected these values to make them weak in total warfare. But they didn't. They made them stronger. Zixathera said quietly. Humans don't fight just for territory, or resources, or political systems. They fight for the right to remain human. Every person on Terra understood that surrender meant the end of their way of life, so every person became a weapon in the defense effort. She fell silent for a moment, lost in memories. When she continued, her voice carried a note of reluctant admiration. Admiral Thompson turned Terra's entire orbital space into a weapon system. Commercial satellites became guided missiles. Civilian spacecraft were converted into ramming vessels. Even space debris was weaponized. They used magnetic fields to accelerate random junk into projectiles that could damage our hull plating. How effective were these improvised weapons? More effective than they should have been, the old warrior admitted. Our ships were designed to defend against military weapons, plasma cannons, missile systems, energy beams. We weren't prepared for attacks by converted garbage haulers and mining equipment. Zixathera's voice grew more agitated. Thompson coordinated these civilian vessels with precision that our tactical computers couldn't match. Cargo ships would emerge from behind asteroids at exactly the right moment to ram our escorts. Mining platforms would fire their industrial lasers in perfect synchronization to overwhelm our shields. What about the ground battle? Worse than the space engagement, the veteran said grimly. General Parker had turned every city, every town, every settlement into a fortress. When our troops landed, they found themselves fighting not just the human military, but the entire human population. She leaned forward, her compound eyes reflecting the recording device's indicator lights. Our soldiers were trained for conventional warfare, capture strategic points, secure supply lines, advance in coordinated formation. On Terra, there were no strategic points because everything was strategic. Every building contained weapons. Every civilian was a potential combatant. Every street was a potential battleground. How did your forces respond? Confusion and panic, Zixathera replied honestly. Our commanders kept requesting orders for situations that weren't covered in any military manual. How do you conduct urban warfare when the entire urban population is actively hostile? How do you secure supply lines when civilians are sabotaging them? How do you advance when every building might contain military equipment? The old Keltharian took a long drink before continuing. Commander Rivera had organized the planetary logistics so efficiently that human resistance actually got stronger as the battle continued. Instead of running out of supplies, they were manufacturing new equipment faster than we could destroy it. How was that possible during an active invasion? Underground factories, hidden supply caches, distributed manufacturing, the veteran listed. Rivera had spent years preparing for this battle, creating redundant systems that could continue operating even under direct attack. Every time we destroyed one facility, 3 others increased production to compensate. Zixathera's voice grew darker. But the manufacturing was just part of it. The real problem was coordination. Rivera somehow managed to coordinate supply deliveries to resistance units across an entire planet, while our forces controlled orbital space and most surface transportation. How? Children again, the old warrior said, shaking her head. Human. Children on bicycles carrying messages and small supplies through areas too dangerous for military vehicles. Our sensors couldn't distinguish between civilian foot traffic and military logistics because they were the same thing. She gestured with her mechanical arm. We controlled the major cities, the spaceports, the industrial centers, but the humans controlled everything else. The roads between cities, the power lines, the communication networks, the water systems. We held the obvious targets while they controlled the infrastructure that made those targets useful. The veteran fell silent for several minutes, staring into her drink. When she spoke again, her voice was filled with exhausted defeat. The Battle of Terra lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks of fighting an entire civilization that refused to accept defeat. Our casualties mounted every day, not just from military action but from stress-related disorders. Soldiers who had fought across the galaxy were breaking down because they couldn't handle the psychological pressure of fighting humans on their homeworld. What kind of psychological pressure? The certainty that they would never give up, Zixathera said quietly. Every other species we had conquered eventually reached a breaking point where continued resistance became irrational. Humans don't have a breaking point. They just keep fighting until they're all dead and they're willing to take as many of us with them as possible. She looked directly at the camera. That realization broke our forces before the humans could break our ships. Admiral Colthessa began receiving reports of entire units refusing to advance, not because they couldn't win, but because they couldn't handle the psychological stress of fighting an enemy that would never surrender. When did the coalition decide to withdraw? When our military psychiatrists submitted a joint report recommending immediate cessation of hostilities, the veteran replied. 12 different species, 12 different psychological evaluation systems, all reaching the same conclusion. Continued combat against humans would result in permanent psychological damage to coalition military personnel. Zixthara finished her drink and set the glass down with finality. The official withdrawal order cited strategic reassessment of objectives and reallocation of resources to more pressing conflicts. The real reason was that we were afraid, not afraid of losing the war, but afraid of what winning would cost us.